Eric Shesky's Weekly You Demon. This Catholic dude abides.
Now that's my new theme song. You're going to be hearing a lot of that. I really dig it. We have a lot of interesting subjects today. We're going to be talking about a Belgian historian named Henri Pirenne. We're going to be talking about a bogus 1974 historical atlas of the world. We'll be sneaking in a discussion about Russell Kirk, one of my heroes. And we'll also give you an introduction to Taoism, that one of the parents of Zen Buddhism, which I think you're really going to enjoy. I hope you like the show. In the beginning was the Tao, and the Tao was with God, and the Tao was God. That's the translation of the Book of John by the Chinese convert John Wu. And it's with that I want to introduce Taoism. We touched on last week when I mentioned that Chan Buddhism, which became known as Zen Buddhism, was a mixture of Mahayana Buddhism and Chinese native Taoism. When the Bodhidharma left India, he came to China, and the two religions kind of mixed. And it dawned on me, really, I should probably have a long segment on Taoism, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to have probably 3 or 4 segments on Taoism. Try to keep them nice and chopped up, consistent with my goal of trying to keep everything under 5 minutes, each segment under 5 minutes. So the first question is, what is the Tao, or what is Taoism? Well, first off, let me tell you what it's not. It's not what Thomas Merton calls the degenerate, that's a quote, degenerate amalgam of superstition, magic, and alchemy that you find like at New Age centers today. I mean, the actual popular religion of Taoism has taken a ton of different forms, many different forms. I'm not going to get into all those by any stretch. I'm just going to be focusing on Taoism as taught by its two greatest its writers or thinkers or non-thinkers, as we'll discover as we go through this. Lao-Tse, who was a contemporary of Shakyamuni, and then Chuang-Tzu, who was about in the 300s. So Lao-Tse was in the 500s. Chuang-Tzu was in the 300s, and that's the type of Taoism we're looking at, and that really is its purest and highest form. So what is it? Well, the Tao, C.S. Lewis defined the Tao as basically natural law and the abolition of man. I don't think that's a very good definition, and it's been years since I looked at the abolition of man, so maybe I'm not being fair to Lewis, but I don't think that's a good definition. The Tao is not really Christ. The Tao is really the way. It's like a way of living, an outlook, an attitude. If you see a parallel in the Book of John, I think it's chapter 14, where Christ says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Yeah, you're seeing a lot of parallels to the Tao, because Christ is a way of life. Taoism is a way, and it's a way that it centers on intense simplicity without the intense part. And what I mean by that is intensity without the straining. It's just living very, very simply. Now I'm going to try to point out Christian parallels, but if you think about St. Therese Lisieux's Little Way, and if you're not acquainted with that, we'll be discussing it later. If you think of St. Therese's Little Way, where you just do every task simply without thinking about the doing, that is really what Tao is, or the way is. It particularly emphasizes a thing called Wu Wei, W-U-W-E-I, which means non-activity. An example I heard one guy give is, think about if you come across a rock and you can't climb over it. It's a huge rock. You can't climb over it. You can't get around it. You can't do anything. What do you do if you want to progress? Well, water gets around it, and eventually water wears it down. And Taoism, or the way, is being like the water. Not struggling with the rock, not hacking at the rock, not trying to push the rock, just flowing around the rock. And that's, if you think about that, that'll kind of give you the Taoist type mindset. And this type of easygoing attitude, gives rise, especially in Chuang-Tzu, of a playfulness. It's like nothing should be, you don't have to stress out or strive for anything. Just kind of enjoy life without thinking about yourself enjoying, just looking out, simply enjoying. It gives rise to a laid back type, playful type attitude. And I think if you consider the Tao in those type of terms, you'll get close to what we're talking about. And I realize this is a short introduction. We'll hit it harder next week, I promise. When I was a kid, I spent hours looking at this 1974 edition of the Anchor Atlas of World History. It's just a little book with, 50 maps of the world at different times. I remember always being intrigued with the map of Europe in 486. That was the date on it. And it showed basically, again, it shows the Roman Empire breaking up supposedly in 476. And they say, as of 486, Europe was divided as follows. And they basically say we have the Kingdom of the Suevi, the Visigothic Kingdom, Burgundian Kingdom, Kingdom of Sagrius, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, Kingdom of the Franks, the Vandal Kingdom, Odoaker's Kingdom, and the Alemanni. And they pretty much said, well, these are the new nations. And again, as I got older, I realized that was just a complete, I don't say complete fabrication, but far more inaccurate than accurate. I did some research one Saturday afternoon, and I went through and traced every single one of those kingdoms, quote-unquote kingdoms. Every single one of them at that point were controlled by a general in the Roman army. See, what happened is the Romans brought in auxiliary troops. As the empire stretched large and larger, they couldn't control it with just Roman citizen troops. So they had to bring in auxiliary troops, barbarian troops. And these barbarian troops were controlled by a general known as a rex. We might translate it as king. They'd bring in this barbarian ruler to act as a general in the Roman army. And then these troops would be like the left flank of the Roman army. They'd control that area, like in battle. And every single one of them, except the Alemanni, that I was not able to trace. That's interesting for other reasons. But every other quote-unquote kingdom that the world history mentioned were governed by a general or his sons. Because all that happened as the Roman Empire fell apart, you basically had barbarian generals working with the local senatorial class to kind of keep running the empire, even though there was no real center anymore, because Rome was pretty much controlled by Odovaker, who was answering to Constantinople in the east. But to call these independent kingdoms is just ridiculous. I believe every single general in these quote-unquote early nations would have considered himself just a general of the Roman army, maybe fighting with other generals for control, like had been going on in imperial Rome for many, many centuries. So, and again, even though this is definitely up for scholarly debate, the early Middle Ages, when the nations start to emerge, really consist of these barbarian generals with their men underneath them controlling large swaths of land, but working with the local senatorial class, because the senators in Rome, the patrician class, they had gradually left Rome and established, latifundias. That's a phrase, latifundia, out in the countryside, and huge estates with their own people on them, and they kind of controlled the areas, and then they worked with these Roman generals to control what we call like the early nation states. So the Franks, for instance, they were basically Roman auxiliary troops, and as the years wore on, the Franks just kind of controlled in their own right until they basically became the rulers of all of France. But it was a slow, gradual process, and we don't have just like a clean cutoff like 476 or anything else. And again, if you talk to pretty much anyone in these areas, the kingdom of the Burgundians or the kingdom of the Franks, ask anyone in there where they live, they'd be like, oh, we're part of the Roman Empire. They all just kind of thought that citizens still existed. So it's kind of, again, it's partly myth, and we're still working out details, but it's fascinating to see these early nation states begin to emerge. But all we really know is they sure as heck didn't emerge like the Anchor Atlas World History from 1974 said they did. They were not distinct units at all at that point. I think in the next episode we're going to explore this a little bit more. We're actually going to leave the fall of the Roman Empire, and we're going to progress into this what we call the real Dark Ages. And I'm also going to try to touch a little bit on this odd school who claims like 200 or 300 years of history really never did exist, and there's some sort of odd conspiracy. We'll try to get into that as well. Lightning segments. I'd like to start the lightning segments with something a little more upbeat, but we're not going to. We're going to start with a Belgian historian named Henri Pirenne. Pirenne. Last week I emphasized that Belloc was the real first historian to posit the idea of the continuous fall of the Roman Empire as opposed to a catastrophic fall. But I think I may have misled you a little bit when I said that until modern archaeology came along, pretty much no one agreed with him. I didn't mean to say that. There was a famous Belgian philosopher, Pirenne, who in the 1930s, about 10-15 years after Belloc, basically said the same thing. He said the Roman Empire continued pretty much unabated until the 600s, at which point Islam arose. Saracen pirates started roaming the Mediterranean, cutting off trade from North Africa, and at that point things went to hell in a handbasket. Kind of interesting, parallel to today. Pirenne was largely excoriated because he was casting aspersions on Islam, and the modern trend up to that point had been to kind of congratulate Islam for preserving Western civilization, and Pirenne was having none of it. He's like, no, they really messed things up pretty badly. You can kind of see the same thing going on today, where if you start criticizing Islam for what it is, people kind of criticize you as not being multicultural enough. Well, Pirenne had that going as well. But that continuous catastrophist argument, the camps really kind of set up opposing forces in the 1930s after Pirenne, even though, in my opinion, from what I can tell, Belloc beat Pirenne to the punch. There's a video, I'll post it to the show notes page, on Henri Pirenne. It's a very good video by a very good college professor. The video, by the way, is a freebie offered by the teaching company. If you're not acquainted with the teaching company, get acquainted with them. It's a great organization. It was started by, I think, an ex-trader who took his money and started a company dedicated to getting the top lecturers from colleges and universities to lecture about a specific topic. And they're pretty much the equivalent of probably like a freshman introductory course at college level. The lectures are amazing. Great overviews of whatever topic you want. They must have 1,000 different lectures. They pay the lecturers very well. I guess lecturers compete for these positions, for these gigs, because it pays so well. They're very high quality, extremely expensive. Two hints though. One, your public library might have it, so get a library card and go see what they have, and you can download them through an awkward app, but it does work. Two, wait for them to go on clearance, and you can download them on clearance. Or three, the best deal of all, get an Audible subscription at Amazon, and you pay like $15 a month, and they'll give you 1 credit. And many of these lectures can be gotten on Amazon with 1 credit. So what would cost you literally $500 with some of these lectures, you can get them for $15 by getting an Audible credit at Amazon. That tip alone is worth the price of admission to this podcast. I've always kind of enjoyed hanging out with older guys, like my dad and his friends, and hearing some of their old stories. One of my favorites, my dad recounting a lost weekend. I'd asked him if he'd ever heard of Charles Bukowski's book, The Lost Weekend. And he goes, yeah. He goes, we all knew about that in the 1950s. And he goes, I only had one lost weekend, and that was when he was in the military and in the Marines during the Korean Wars. He was stationed in Southern California near San Diego. He and his buddies got a weekend pass, and they pretty much is just one big blur. He said they spent the weekend crashing the Hotel Mercury. That always kind of cracked me up. Another one of my favorite stories is an old law partner of mine named John. Went to University of Michigan Law School in the 1960s. And this is off-color, by the way, so you want to cover your children's ears. He said, for some reason, it's always cracked me up. In the 1960s, it was just common for the law students, when they walk up to one another, to greet each other with, "Good morning, motherfucker." And then the other one would respond, "Good morning, Reverend." Alright, I know. This is a Catholic podcast, and this guy is dropping the mofo. And it's something I struggle with, quite frankly. You know, how sinful or how bad is the F word or any vulgarity. Well, in this case, though, I was kind of encouraged. A long-time blog reader and kind of contacted me out of the blue and mentioned that he's enjoying the podcast and enjoys the mix of the balance between the reverent and the irreverent. So I'm kind of taking that and thinking, okay, maybe a little more irreverence is good. And I appreciate that doesn't mean vulgarity, which the mofo is. And no, you don't need to ban your kids from listening to this. You'll never hear me on this podcast use the F word gratuitously, or any vulgarity for that matter. For the most part. Yeah, when you hear it, it's always going to be in the context of a quote. Some of you may remember in the old podcast feed, I told the story about the distinguished historian Robert Conquest, who had been saying for years in the middle of the 20th century that Stalin had killed tens of millions of people, and the left kind of dismissed him as a crank. And then when the Soviet Union fell, the records came out, and it was very clear that Stalin had indeed done that. And someone asked him, how does he feel after being ridiculed all those years? How does he feel being vindicated? And what would he say to his detractors now? And he said, I would say, I told you so, you stupid motherfuckers. And this was a very smart, distinguished historian. And I guess the takeaway from this is, the F word's kind of part of our culture. And even though I don't encourage its use, if you're going to relate anecdotes and tell stories, it's going to come up. But yeah, you don't need to worry. I don't think I'm going to mark these podcasts explicit on Apple Podcasts, because it's not going to become that type of podcast. I think I will look for an article by Theodore Dalrymple, and I'll post it to my show notes page. Dalrymple, as some of you may know, is a medical doctor, a brilliant prose stylist, very learned, urbane. And he wrote basically an article on, why it's okay to use the F word. And yes, he 100% agrees, vulgarity normally is just a substitute for thought. When you're using vulgarity, you're not usually thinking clearly. It's just laziness, quite frankly. That's why vulgarity is typically associated with more, white trash. Because they're just quite often just dumb. And by swearing, it's just a shortcut for actually thinking through what you actually want to say, looking for more descriptive adjectives or precise adjective verbs, nouns, gerunds, whatever it is. So again, not a big fan of the F word, but as Dalrymple points out, it's a pretty filthy article. I'm going to warn you right now, he probably uses the F word 20, 30 times. But when used cleverly, it can be pretty funny, and I think somewhat acceptable. Subject to this serious caveat, you always have to realize when you use that, you're reflecting on your faith. And that's a serious concern if you're a Christian or a Catholic. Some people just don't get it. They don't get that, like, the word shit became forbidden after the Battle of Hastings in 1066, when the French nobility didn't use words like that, or bastard or bitch, that those were all like the Old English, and those words just became considered vulgarities. That's not a violation of the second commandment, but to the extent that you're reflecting poorly on your faith, it's a big problem. The F word, by the way, is not in that 1066 milieu. I read a fascinating essay once that talked about where the F word came from, and the takeaway was two things. One, we don't know where it came from, but two, every language seems to have something like the F word in it. So it's this kind of bizarre. I wish I had touched on this last week for Halloween, but I think a lot of you know I'm a big Russell Kirk fan. Russell Kirk, for those who aren't aware, he wrote a bestseller in 1953, I believe it was published, called The Conservative Mind, where he kind of put together, if you will, or created maybe, an intellectual tradition of conservatism. The book, again, was a huge hit. I think it more or less set him for life. I remember finding the book at a bookstore in Niles, Michigan. Niles is just north of South Bend, Indiana, and I was going to law school at Notre Dame, and there's this cool bookstore out in the country I just stumbled across one day, and I picked up The Conservative Mind. I remember reading it in the law library. It's probably my third year. I didn't have much time for recreational reading my first 2 years in law school, and just being totally taken by this book, just totally blown away by it. And a couple of friends walking by, asking what I'm reading, and I show it to them, and excited to explain to them what it's all about. And they kind of just looked at each other and laughed at me and walked away. And I guess not totally inappropriate. It kind of hurt a little bit, but I didn't even care. I was so excited by this book. So anyway, I became a big Russell Kirk fan. Found out later that he is actually from Michigan, Mecosta, Michigan, which is north of Grand Rapids, but south of Traverse City on the west side of the state. Now, I remember one time I was, this is back in 1991, 1992. I was living in the Detroit area after graduating from law school. And at Russell Kirk's recommendation in his splendid book, Enemies of the Permanent Things, I had bought at his recommendation Eric Voegelin's 5-volume work, Order in History. Now, I was having a heck of a time understanding it, quite frankly. Voegelin's not to be taken lightly, and maybe that's the only way I can take anything. And I was really struggling with it. I remember just, I'm kind of a jackass, but getting so frustrated. I was like, going, dang it, Russell Kirk recommended I read this. Russell Kirk can tell me what it's about. So I called information, 555-1212, and I got his number up in Mecosta, Michigan, and I called him. And someone picked up the phone, called Russell. Russell came to the phone and talked to me for like 10 to 15 minutes about it. Hard to understand, I remember, but it was very helpful. Just a heck of a nice guy. Just like, yeah, you bought that volume, those volumes of my recommendation. Sure, I'll try to explain to you the general gist of it. So kind of presumptuous, but kind of funny. About, 15 years later, I wrote a biography for Touchstone magazine about Russell Kirk called The Conservative Convert. Russell Kirk, later in life, he had married a Catholic named Annette Kirk, and he converted to Catholicism. And I wrote this fairly lengthy essay for Touchstone. It was a couple thousand words. And his widow, Annette, saw it, and she actually invited me up to Mecosta for a weekend. It was a weekend when Hillsdale College was going to have a bunch of students up there, and they had some other speakers coming up to talk about Russell Kirk and other topics. So, yeah, I jumped at the chance, and I went up there, and I stayed in, I forget which one of his daughter's rooms. The daughters had moved out, by the way. His daughters are very attractive, but they had moved out at that point. And I spent the weekend talking with Annette a lot, a charming lady, as what I call one of the most enchanting weekends of my life. And I always meant to make it back, and I never did, and I kind of regret that. Oh, heck, I forgot to mention two things. One, I can say Russell Kirk's daughters are good-looking because they're not as good-looking as my wife, who regularly listens to this podcast. And secondly, the reason I meant to mention Russell Kirk last weekend is because he was really into ghosts. He believed in ghosts. In his autobiography, This Sort of Imagination, talks about ghosts and seeing them. And he wrote a lot of ghost stories, which I greatly enjoyed. They're definitely worth checking out if you get a chance. And I'll try to post a link to a couple of them on the show notes page. Alright, that's it for this episode. Hope you enjoyed it. Remember, go to iTunes and subscribe, leave a rating. Make sure you go into The Weekly Demon. You'll see it has the same old cover art, but then it also has lettering on it that says The Weekly Demon with Eric Shesky. That's the one you want to subscribe to. The old feed will be discontinued. Also, check out udemonpodcast.com. That's the homepage for the podcast. You'll find show notes, a library of book reviews, and other things I think you'll find interesting. Thanks for listening.